The Shepnaz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. I'm here with Pastor Rob, and this past Sunday, we started a new message series called Exile. As always, you can go back and look at the entire service if you wanted to from the past Sunday. Also, yesterday, we started to do a little bit of a breakdown of the background of Peter, who is the writer of 1 Peter. So today, we're actually going to get into the study and taking a look into the book of 1 Peter. So, Pastor Rob, welcome back in.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm excited about this new series.
Yes.
we just lost our lights. One of these days we'll fix that. They're back on now, so great. Yeah, so yesterday we talked about just a little bit of background stuff about Peter and who he was, and we'll jump into the book today. And you'll probably never guess who is the author of 1 Peter.
John?
Very close, very close. Yeah, it was Peter. But here's what's interesting is that there's a lot of question initially whether or not Peter was the author of this letter. And part of that is because the grammar, or the Greek grammar of the book is so good. And Peter was like there's another place, I think in the book of Acts, it says, well, who are these uneducated guys who are talking so smart? When the Holy Spirit came. And so Peter wasn't an educated person. He was a fisherman. He didn't go to school and, at least, higher levels of learning or anything. And so when people read the book, the Greek grammatical structure of it is excellent. And so people are like, did he really write that? So,
is there a discussion? Do they think that perhaps he was telling a scribe what he wanted to say?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And so the guy, Silas, was the guy who was kind of like his secretary, recording secretary. He was an educated
had
and
much
learned
better
man.
grammar.
Yeah. And so Peter's telling him, this is what the Lord's telling me. This is what I want to write to the church. And as Peter's saying it, Silas is writing it, and he's writing it correctly, And so the words are actually Peter's. It came from the Holy Spirit, but it was Silas who helped. And Peter even says that at the very end. This is the thing that helps everybody. Is in chapter 5, verse 12, it says, with the help of Silas, whom I regard as a faithful brother, I have written to you briefly, encouraging you and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. And so Silas was a very highly respected leader in the church. And if you read through the book of Acts, there's Petra has a song that Paul and Silas were thrown in jail. Remember that story? They were thrown in jail. And so Silas had a great ministry with Paul. And here we see Silas connected to Peter as well. So Silas was a leader in the Jerusalem church, and he was a very learned man. In fact, Acts 15:32 says he was a prophet, and it says Judas and Silas, who themselves were prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the brothers. And so Silas was a leader, and he was a very important person. And I think it just says a lot about the importance and the weight of Peter's message, that there would be such a well-respected, educated leader listening to what Peter had to say and writing it so that the rest of the church could hear it. And again, this letter was not just to a small group of people. This was distributed very widely. And so it was a big deal. So it's as opposed to a movie that gets released in a few places, this was released wide, really a lot of people got a hold of this. Another thing that I think is really important to know is when the book was written. And so it was written in somewhere between 64 and 65 AD, and that's really, really important. But to give you some context, the Gospels were written in between 60 and 100 AD. So Peter writes this letter as the Gospels are even being written. And it's only 30 years after Jesus lives, less than 30 in some cases maybe, depending on how the time starts. But Jesus was 33, and so it could have been about 30 years after Jesus was crucified and resurrected that this letter was written. So Christianity is very young. It's in its infancy stages. The Gospels are still being written. People don't have these books to read like the Bible we have. They're still reading the Old Testament and just hearing the stories that are being passed down to by mouth. But then the apostles are starting to write these things down. But what's
a question for you? So that being said, so just to kind of put a frame of reference to it, so you think Peter at this point is maybe in his 50s or early 60?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I would say I think I did read somewhere probably in his 50s, because he would have been in his 20s, late 20s, early 30s maybe when Jesus came.
Right.
So yeah, in about his 50s. Yeah, I think I read that somewhere. But what's so important to know about when it was written, which is the year AD 64, 65, is that in July of AD 64, Rome burned to the ground. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, let me tell you this story, right? So in July of AD 64, Nero, who was in his 20s, he was the emperor of Rome, like this 20-year-old punk, really is what he was, is leading Rome. And he like is got an ego like nobody else has ever had. And he's the emperor of Rome, the largest, colony or country or whatever you want to call it, empire at that time. And he decides that he doesn't like the way Rome is laid out. So he's like, I really want to rebuild this. And I have these ideas of how I want to rebuild it. And I want it to be my city, right? And so history books say that Nero started a fire in Rome. And you've probably heard the phrase, Rome burned, or the burning of Rome or whatever. He's the one that started it, and by the time that it was all said and done, in 6 days, 71% of the entire city of Rome burned to the ground. So the city was divided up into districts. There were 14 of them. 10 of them were totally destroyed by fire. And you might be saying, well, how did Rome burn? Because aren't all the buildings? You look at the buildings, and they're like stone, and how does stone burn? And while some of the buildings, the really rich governmental buildings or whatever, were stone, most of the rest of the city was not. And inside those stone buildings, the floors and the rafters and all that was made of wood. So when those start to burn, the building falls in on itself. And so the big buildings burned, and then a lot of the houses that are like poor, like slums almost, they were all made of wood, and they were very close. And so when one of them caught on fire, for sure the next one, and it was just like a wildfire that spread. The other thing they say historically is that it was a very windy day, and then of course a large fire creates enough wind in itself. And I'm thinking back to the fire that just happened not too long ago in Maui. Remember that? I mean, that just took off, and before anybody could do anything, the city, that city was burned. That there was lots of wind and embers blew, and so other parts of the city began catching on fire. And again, when it was all said and done, 10 of the 14 districts burned down. So many people say Nero did it, that he's the one who started it, because they said that there were people who were taking embers from the fires and going to other places and starting fires. And people tried to stop them and say, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're under orders to burn the city." And they would never say who it was that they were under orders from, but everybody, this is Nero.
There's only one person that can do that.
Yeah. And so then Nero burns the city down, right? Well, then what happened was, the unintended part of that is that this backfired on Nero, because the Roman culture was totally devastated. Like, you lose 71% of everything in your city. You lose your culture, you lose your religious buildings, they lost their idols, their shrines, their altars, all the places that they worship, and the people began to say their gods couldn't save them from this terrible thing, right? And not only that, but our gods were burned up in this fire. Our God must not be all that he was cracked up to be.
Well, that was definitely true.
Correct, right. But the people are homeless, and they're hopeless, and many of them lost family members. So you have all these people who live in this town who are now hopeless and homeless, have lost family members, and they hear that Nero started this. He's having you think Biden's poll numbers are bad. This guy's numbers were really bad, right?
Yeah.
And so what he did was he concocted a lie and spread it in order to save himself. And the lie that he concocted was that the Christians started the fire.
On February 14th, we will be observing an Ash Wednesday time of remembrance as we look toward Easter. On Ash Wednesday, Christians around the world gather to reflect on our mortality, a call for repentance, and prepare our hearts for the season of Lent. Join us for this at 6:30. Kids are welcome, and there will be childcare for the youngest and wiggliest kids.
And so already the Christians were seen as a kind of a rebellious sect of the Jews, and the Jews were not that well liked back then either, right? And so then you have this group of people that are somewhat connected to the Jews, but are even more rebellious. So they're even disliked more. They didn't worship the same gods that they all worship. They didn't participate in the culture and the debauchery and the idolatry and all this stuff or whatever. And so when Nero blamed the Christians, everybody turned on the Christians, and they began to experience this persecution that was incredibly intense, right? So they're already on the outside, and now it's even worse. Many of them were caught, they were tortured, they were put in jail, they were beaten, they were stoned, they were stretched, they were crucified, they were tied to stakes and fed to wild animals. They were released in the Colosseum with animals to see if they could catch them and eat them, and that was entertainment to the Romans at that time.
Wow.
And one of the things that the Romans were famous for was making the punishment match the crime. So that was just one of the things they were known for.
Sure.
So what they would do when they would find a Christian, because the crime, according to Nero, was that they started this giant fire, they would tie these Christians to poles and put stuff all around them, and they would light them up. They would catch them on fire at night to give light to the rebuilding and the cleaning up stuff. And it was like people would come in just to watch Christians burn. I mean, it was absolutely horrendous and terrible what was happening. And remember, this is just 30 years after Jesus died. And many of these people that are experiencing this persecution are people that came to know Jesus through Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, maybe.
Right.
There are people who came to know Jesus through Paul's missionary journeys. And so, I mean, they're really new. I mean, the church isn't established then like it is now. So they're experiencing this great persecution. And what happens was, as a result of that, they fled Rome, right? And they fled to these other places. And in the first verse of Peter, 1 Peter, he says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the chosen who are residing temporarily in the dispersion." And the dispersion that he's talking about is where everybody went. Like all the Christians were scattered. They're like, we can't live here anymore. Our families are getting taken from us. We're dying. We're getting killed. We're getting tortured and persecuted. So they're like, we're out of here, right? And then he lists the places like Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And all those places are in modern day Turkey. So they fled Rome, and either by boat or by foot, they walked miles and miles and traveled to these other places that were not necessarily Christian friendly. They just weren't being persecuted like they were in Rome.
Right.
And so you probably have heard the term, maybe even on the news recently, called the diaspora. And the diaspora is just a Greek word for the dispersed. And the word literally means scattered over an area. And in religious context, it's almost always connected to people who ally themselves with the God of Israel, right? So the dispersion or the diaspora are Jews who are not living in their homeland of Israel, and they're spread all out. Well, if you remember when we had Rabbi
Silverman,
Silverman in here, he talked about the diaspora. He even used that word, and he talked about how Jews are gathering back again in their homeland.
Right.
And so they're coming out of exile and coming back to their homeland. Well, this was the beginning of the exile. This was the beginning when people are like, we can't live where we are anymore. We've got to go. And so we talk about this word exile, and exile literally is just a state or a period of forced or voluntary absence from your country or your home. So if you're in exile, it's like you're not at home because you've chosen to leave or you've been forced to leave. And for the Christians here, it was their choice. I mean, they were sort of forced, but no one made them leave. But if they stayed, they were going to continue to face this persecution. So they're like, we're leaving. So they're living in exile, right? And again, there's lots of reasons that can happen, but they're being persecuted and for their faith. And I think the other thing that just to really remember that's really important is that it's not like it isn't like their grandparents were Christians. They're not like second or third generation Christians.
Right.
They don't have this history of things. they're the first generation of believers in Jesus. And this is what you get.
Well, and even when you were talking about the time frames and everything, and I was thinking about the fact that, the church at this point is only maybe 20, 30 years old.
Yeah.
And, we have people in our congregation right now that have been at Shepherd longer than that.
Yeah.
And I mean, just to kind of put that frame of reference of like, that's how new this whole faith was. And the other thing while you were talking that kind of stuck out to me is, when we started this discussion, we were talking about how well it was written.
Yeah.
And the grammar was right and the message was right. And so even in this moment of where obviously there's chaos going on in society. I mean, literally Rome is burning and people are blaming the Christians and there's propaganda from the government. I mean, we can't relate to any of this, right? But but while all that is happening, you see this just consistent hand where Peter is not, it's not like he's scribbling something really quick to get out to everybody like, hey, this is happening and this is what you need to do. Yeah. It's like, okay, I'm going to sit down and we're just going to listen to what the Spirit has to say to the exiles and take the time to do it right. And you don't see, you don't feel like there's fear there. You don't feel like there's panic there. It's like, yes, this is what's happening and I'm going to address all of you that are in exile.
You're right. It's very intentional and thought out, and it's not a reaction, but it's like, hey, it's like Peter's a pastor to all these people. He's like, my people are being persecuted, and I need to make sure they know how to live in the midst of this. And when we start going through the book of First Peter and we see what the instruction that Peter gives them on how to live, it's a hard stuff because they're going through really deep stuff. They've seen their family members die, and they're being persecuted. And Peter says, "Love them."
Wow.
I mean, it's just the stuff that he says, and that's why I think this book is just so relevant to the world we live in. I mean, we're not being persecuted physically, but there's a hostility and an antagonism toward Christianity. And we can't respond the way the world does. Right. And Peter says, here's how to respond.
Cool.
And so just a couple other things real quick, and then we'll wrap this one up. But what's interesting is that Peter also, he writes at the end of the book, he says that, he kind of gives let me just remind you who I am and where this is coming from and all that. And he says this, he says, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings, and so does my son Mark. So the she is, I think he's talking about the church, but he says is in Babylon. So what's interesting is that there's 3 Babylons. There's the real big city of Babylon. Then there's these 2 smaller ones. And everybody's trying to figure out where was he when he wrote this. And almost all theologians have come to this agreement that he was using a code name, that he was in Rome, but he was using a code name. And that was the code name that Christians used for Rome because it was Babylon, right? I mean, there's debauchery and persecution, all this other kind of stuff. And the reason he didn't say, I'm writing from Rome, is because of what's happening in Rome right now.
Sure.
And he didn't want to be found, and he didn't want if somebody found the letter, he didn't want to endanger other Christians. So there was this code, and we've seen this in a couple other passages in a couple other books as well, where the author was kind of giving some code that everybody probably knew and understood at that time.
Oh, sure.
Doesn't make sense to us, but it's like the reason they were doing it is because they were trying to protect those people. And so this letter then, just as a reminder, is to the diaspora. It's to the Christians, and they were Jews and Gentiles both at this point. So that's really important to know, that it's not just the Jewish people, it's the Gentile people. So it's people who are Christians who maybe weren't from Jerusalem or from Israel, God's chosen group, right? It was anybody who now has put their faith and trust in Jesus is the church.
Right.
And so he's writing to all these people, and they're all in exile. So I think that's a good spot to stop, just to realize who this letter is being written to, what they're going through when they receive this letter. So when they receive this letter, they want to know what Peter has to say. Right. It's like, how do we live in this crazy time? And then it's so encouraging. And then tomorrow I want to talk about exile, because I think that's a very fascinating metaphor for the church today. And just the quick teaser is like, I think the church in America is living in exile, and I'll make a case for that tomorrow, and how we can live, and how this book is so relevant to the way we should be living.
Well, that sounds great. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Like I said, go back and take a look at the message and the past couple days when we've been talking about this. Tomorrow, we're going to get into Rob's case of why the church in America is in exile and how he's going to prove it.
Oh boy, that's deep.
So if you want to see what's going on with the church, go to shepnaz.org. Also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can always reach out to us by emailing podcast@shepnaz.org. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.